Hello everyone, Ace here, and today let's talk about another news article. One that is a classic case of I can't believe someone thought it was a good idea to write this. Today's article comes from The Globe and Mail, written by one Michael Coren, simply titled "The Far Right's Fixation on Pedophilia is Dangerous." Yes, you heard that right. This is an article being critical of the fact that the far right is against pedophilia. And surprise, surprise, it is being written because of the success of the recently released Sound of Freedom film. Of course, Michael Coren, who by the way states that he is a priest in the article, can't actually point to anything specifically wrong within the film itself, but then goes on to talk about the opinions that the leading actor has, because as we all know, every single film in history has perfectly and accurately represented the politics of the leading actor within it. Or at least that's what you'd have to believe that the complaints regarding the positions that the leading actor has are in any way relevant as a critique of the film itself. However, I've already countered that very specific critique in the past with other articles. Instead, there is a separate passage that I want to focus on with this article. As Coren goes on to state, quote, "But today the accused are usually singled out not by race, but ideology. And that includes politicians and public figures considered to be left of center, or even people who support vaccinations, abortion rights, LGBTQ equality, or climate justice policies." In other words, Coren has noticed that people are starting to link pedophilia and support of pedophilia to far left politics. And note that I'm not saying left of center, I am very specifically talking about the far left. So with that in mind, is there a link between socialists on the far left and advocacy for pedophilia and sexualizing children? Well, strap yourselves in, because I'm going to be providing plenty of evidence to show that yes, there is indeed such a link. And what better way to start showing this link than to start quoting far left academics and see what they themselves have to say. To start off, allow me to read to you what the far left socialist Wilhelm Reich had to say in his book titled The Mass Psychology of Fascism. Specifically, Reich states, quote, "We have found the institutions in which the economic and the sexual interests of the authoritarian system meet. We have to ask ourselves how this comes about. This question is also answered by character analysis, provided one does not exclude such questions from character analytic investigation. Suppression of the natural sexuality in the child, particularly of its genital sexuality, makes the child apprehensive, shy, obedient, afraid of authority, good, and adjusted in the authoritarian sense. It paralyzes the rebellious forces because any rebellion is laden with anxiety. It produces, by inhibiting sexual curiosity and sexual thinking in the child, a general inhibition of thinking and of critical faculties. In brief, the goal of sexual suppression is that of producing an individual who is adjusted to the authoritarian order, and who will submit to it in spite of all misery and degradation. At first, the child has to adjust to the structure of the authoritarian miniature state, the family. This makes it capable of later subordination to the general authoritarian system. The formation of the authoritarian structure takes place through the anchoring of sexual inhibition and sexual anxiety. The result of this process is fear of freedom and a conservative reactionary mentality. Sexual repression aids political reaction not only through this process, which makes the mass individual passive and unpolitical, but also by creating in his structure an interest in actively supporting the authoritarian order. The suppression of natural sexual gratification leads to various kinds of substitute gratifications. Natural aggression, for example, becomes brutal sadism, which then is an essential mass psychological factor in imperialistic wars. In other words, Wilhelm Reich is arguing that sexual repression turns people into fascists. And it is worth noting that he is, of course, basing his ideas upon the far left myth that fascists were somehow far right. And for the record, they weren't. However, the key takeaway to keep in mind here is that this far leftist academic has taken up the position that sexual repression of children directly leads to fascism. And so if you're someone that believes Wilhelm Reich's position, then the best way to stop fascism by that logic would be to, of course, sexualize children. Now, any sane, rational individual knows that this is an absolutely horrific idea and would be truly appalled by it. Unfortunately, the people who take up this position are neither sane nor rational. But if you think, however, that Wilhelm Reich is the only far leftist to have ever said something like this, well, you would be very, very mistaken. Take, for example, what Miele had to say in his book Towards a Gay Communism. Specifically, Miele states, quote, "In dealing with the assertion of heterosexuality, we have seen how its supremacy, determined by the way of the Oedipal phase, is based on the repression of homoerotic tendencies. The revolutionary homosexual struggle is thus waged against a form of oppression that is prior to Oedipus. Oedipus is negated by negating its premises. Deleuze, again with benevolent impulse, admits, there is of course a revolutionary potential in certain homosexual groups. I believe this is not just because they are homosexual. It is rather that their homosexuality has allowed them to question the differences between the sexes, and through this questioning they become able in their marginal position to tackle the problem of sexual desire as well. Thank you very much. We revolutionary queens see in the child not so much Oedipus, or the future Oedipus, as the potentially free human being. We do indeed love children. We are able to desire them erotically in response to their own erotic wishes, and we can openly and with open arms grasp the rush of sensuality that they pour out and make love with them. That is why pedophilia is so strictly condemned. It sends messages of love to the child, whom society, through the family, seeks to traumatize, educastrate, and negate, imposing on the child's eroticism the Oedipal grid. The oppressive heterosexual society forces the child into the latency period, but this is nothing but the deadly introduction to the prison of a latent life. Pedophilia, on the other hand, is an arrow of libido directed at the fetus. In other words, Mario Miele not only thinks that sexual repression is a bad thing and that pedophilia is a good thing, but that pedophilia will also turn children into being communist revolutionaries. And so if you're a far leftist and your goal is to turn people into communist revolutionaries, and you believe what Mario Miele has to say as far as a method to accomplish that, then it's not exactly difficult to see why exactly you would start supporting that sort of disgusting behavior. And on that subject, those two previous passages were an absolute slog to get through because of just how disgusted I became reading the damn things. But unfortunately, I'm also only getting started here. And I really do need to make the point of just how pervasive this mindset is within far leftist ideology. So let's move on to another far leftist, specifically Gayle Rubin. Most notably, let's talk about where she says, quote, "It is harder for most people to sympathize with actual boy lovers. Like communists and homosexuals in the 1950s, boy lovers are so stigmatized that it is difficult to find defenders for their civil liberties, let alone their exotic orientation. Consequently, the police have feasted on them. Local police, the FBI, and watchdog postal inspectors have joined to build a huge apparatus whose sole aim is to wipe out the community of men who love underaged youth. In 20 years or so, when some of the smoke has cleared, it will be much easier to show that these men have been the victims of a savage and undeserved witch hunt. A lot of people will be embarrassed by their collaboration with this persecution, but it will be too late to do much good for those men who have spent their lives in prison." So yeah, that's Gayle Rubin just casually comparing homosexuality to pedophilia, to try to argue that pedophilia isn't actually bad, and instead is just an innocent sexual orientation. And not only that, but that pedophiles are also victims. Rather than victimizers like everyone else thinks. It's also worth noting, by the way, that Gayle Rubin isn't just some random nobody. She is a key far leftist academic figure, and the work that this quote comes from, Thinking Sex, is often considered to be her magnum opus. So I've already demonstrated the link, at least academically speaking, of how far leftists think in this manner. But do they actually push for pedophilia, you may ask? Well, let's take the example of France in the 1970s, when age of consent laws were being discussed there, and when there was a push by academic philosophers to get rid of age of consent laws, period, in France. As one article covering the topic states, quote, "In 1977, some of the most famous names of the French intellectual world, including Sartre, Barthes, Beauvoir, Deleuze, Guattari, Foucault, and Derrida, signed a series of petitions in major newspapers calling for the decriminalization of sexual relations between adults and minors, pointing to the discrepancy between a, quote, antiquated law, unquote, and contemporary sexual mores. These texts argued that when no violence was involved, minors should be granted full freedom to take on sexual decisions." So yeah, a whole bunch of French philosophers decided to argue that pedophilia should be legal. But how does that relate to socialists or the far left, you may ask? Well, the answer is that of the names listed, with the sole exception of Derrida, every single one of those philosophers listed were open socialists. And emphasis on open socialists, by the way, because in the case of Derrida, while he never admitted to being a socialist openly, it is of note that he did have a habit of oh so conveniently supporting socialist candidates candidates and snubbing anyone who was right of center. Gee, I really wonder what his secret political opinions were. But it's not just France where this kind of behavior was exhibited by the far left. On that subject, let's move on to the Kentler experiment from West Berlin, which was a government-backed experiment to deliberately place foster kids into the homes of pedophiles during the Cold War. And sadly, no, like everything else I've talked about today, I am not making that up. But as you could probably guess, far-left scientist Kentler, who the experiment is of course named after, was doing this because he was a big fan of Wilhelm Reich's school of thought. You know, the school of thought that says that fascism is created by sexual repression, and you should thus sexualize children in order to prevent fascism, somehow. Sadly, as horrific as the experiment itself is, Kentler was far from the only person doing this sort of thing in Germany at that time, as the article I have provides additional context by stating, quote, "Suddenly it seemed as if all relationship structures could and must be reconfigured, if there was any hope of producing a generation less damaged than the previous one. In the late 60s, educators in more than 30 German cities and towns began establishing experimental daycare centers, where children were encouraged to be naked and to explore one another's bodies. Quote, there is no question that they were trying, in a desperate sort of neo-Rousseauian authoritarian anti-authoritarianism, to remake German/human nature," unquote, Herzog writes. Kentler inserted himself into a movement that was urgently working to undo the sexual legacy of fascism but struggling to differentiate among various taboos. In 1976, the magazine Das Blatt argued that forbidden sexual desire, such as that for children, was, quote, "the revolutionary event that turns our everyday life on its head, that lets feelings break out and that shatters the basis of our thinking," unquote. A few years later, Germany's newly established Green Party, which brought together anti-war protesters, environmental activists, and veterans of the student movement, tried to address the, quote, "oppression of children's sexuality," unquote. Members of the party advocated abolishing the age of consent for sex between children and adults. So yeah, not only was the Kentler experiment going on in West Berlin, but you also had daycare centers which were set up to deliberately sexualize children, as well as the Green Party openly advocating for the legalization of pedophilia altogether. And again, we're supposed to see it as paranoia, and as a conspiracy theory to dare tie the support of pedophilia to far-left politics. It's not exactly paranoia if it's built upon well-established fact. But if you think that that's all in the past and is not representative of modern far leftists, well, allow me to provide yet one more example. One that is in fact very current news. And not only that, but is even a topic that far leftists typically love to talk about when they try to pull a gotcha on anyone that they don't like. That topic being child marriage laws. Now, in response to this particular gotcha, I have of course taken it upon myself to try to figure out what the hell is going on with regards to child marriage laws. And what I've ultimately found is that the information that people have access to is almost completely contradictory, with every single source that I've seen disagreeing on almost everything with regards to the topic, especially when it comes to the laws that are apparently on the books for each state. In fact, perhaps the only thing that the various sources that I have seen all have in common is the fact that far leftists don't want to be widely known. That being that the state with the most lax child marriage laws is the state of California, a far leftist stronghold. California has zero minimum age requirement for marriage. A literal newborn baby could be married off, and apparently the legal process for doing so is also the most lax of the various states in the union. And keep in mind, the far leftists want you to think that they are champions of ending child marriage, except they're not. In fact, in California, they're the reason why California has such lax child marriage legislation. To quote an article from the Los Angeles Times, what's more surprising is that opposition to a prohibition on marriage before 18 has not been driven by Republicans, as in other states, but by progressive groups, including the ACLU and Planned Parenthood, both of which have sway in the majority Democrat legislature. Among their concerns is that a total ban on marriage of minors could be a slippery slope and impede constitutional rights or reproductive choices, including access to abortion. Yes, you heard that correctly. Planned Parenthood came out in support of child marriage, including up to literal infants, specifically because they think that it somehow protects abortion rights to do so. Also keep in mind that, as the article mentions later on, the far left already got an earlier ban shut down completely in 2017, and this article was made in response to the far leftists trying to do this a second time earlier this month. And it does appear like they're going to succeed in shutting the bill down again. So when I look at Michael Coren's article and how he's upset that people are criticizing the far left, and people he describes as just wanting to protect gay rights and abortion rights, well, keep in mind the people he's trying to defend are the ones actively tying the gay community to pedophilia, like Gail Rubin, or actively saying that women can't have abortion rights without child marriage being legal, as being argued by Planned Parenthood. As you can probably tell, I'm not exactly a fan of this article or the person that wrote it. And frankly, even reading the evidence that I have provided today to prove why the article is wrong has been absolutely more than enough to make my blood boil. But I believe I've said all that really needs to be said here. So I'll finish by stating that I'll of course be leaving links in the description below to the sources that I have used, so you can check them out for yourself if you should so desire. But in any case, this has been Ace. Hope to see you guys again soon. Take care. Ace out.